Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today we wanted to go back to basics a little bit, and I was trying to think of some of the fundamental parts of being an app developer, and one of the most essential, probably in some ways the most essential in terms of distribution, part of development is iTunes Connect. And I thought it'd be kind of interesting to just spend a week kind of just talking through the various parts of iTunes Connect, and specifically just kind of the places that we, the ways in which we actually use it on a daily or ongoing basis. Because I think there's a lot of little corners and things inside of iTunes Connect that are things that I probably just take for granted, having done this for so long, but could hopefully be useful or interesting more generally. And so, if you're if you're playing along at home and want to open up iTunes Connect and follow along, you can probably do that. But at a high level, we're just kind of walk through the various sections, because I think that's when you open up iTunes Connect, you get this little launch bar, launchpad. There we go. It's like whatever that Mac thing is, where you get all the icon screen to launch icons, and we have there's the help and agreements and users, payments, sales, analytics, and my apps, and I think we'll just kind of go through there. I guess we can start with resources and help. Do you ever go to resources and help, Marco?
Only if I actually need to file some kind of trouble ticket, and this is very rare. This might happen once a year, where some a test flight build will get stuck, or something like when I launched subscriptions, the app was approved, but the subscription wasn't. The in-app purchase wasn't approved, even though it was tied to it. And it's basically whenever there's what appears to be a bug in iTunes Connect, I will go there. I used to have to go there on the rare occasion that I would file expedited review requests, but I haven't filed one of those since we got fast reviews in the last year, because I haven't needed to.
Yeah, and I think that's basically the same experience that I have. And I will actually say iTunes Connect, customer support is typically pretty responsive and good. If there are these weird issues or bugs and problems, I've had things where it seems like it's, been stuck in processing for the App Store for longer than it should or whatever. And I reach out, and who knows if they're actually the ones changing it, but it seems like things get resolved fairly well. And if you're starting out, there is a tremendous amount of help documentation and videos and screencasts and things in there. So
there's videos?
Yeah, they do. They have all kinds of stuff about how to use iTunes Connect. It's a pretty good thing, I imagine, if you're starting out. And I think some of it's also there's a lot of good content that's come out of WWDC sessions, because there's usually an iTunes Connect related track or section of talks that are probably good to talk to as well.
Man, where do you find the time to be such a good student of everything?
I'm not I haven't said that. Just knowing that the videos exist is very different than actually having watched them all.
Still, I have hardly poked around these areas at all, because most of the time there's a million other things that I want to do besides navigate iTunes Connect for fun.
Maybe I just need a hobby.
Maybe we found your hobby.
Yeah, my hobby is looking around at documentation. Anyway, moving on. The next one is agreements, tax, and banking, which for me, this is the place that I go, it seems every 3 or 4 months, and have to click a bunch of I agree buttons, to just say that, yes, I whatever the new terms are, it's probably not a great thing, but I never really understand what the changes are, or what's going on, because it's one of those, whatever they are, I need to accept them, because if I don't accept them, I don't have any apps, and if I don't have any apps, I don't have any business. So, it's I'm very much Lando Calrissian in this situation. I can't really, there's nothing that I can do to change the deal, so I just hope it doesn't change any further.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually read the terms as they change, because same boat. It's well, we don't really have a choice in whether we accept these terms or not. Either we accept the terms, or we don't do business here anymore. So it's whatever they say, I'm going to have to say yes. So why spend any time actually reading them? And if there's anything incredibly obscene in there, other people will find it and will be tweeting about it and blogging about it and stuff. So I don't actually it's kind of selfish, but I don't need to spend my time looking at that, because I know that A, I don't really have any choice, and B, other people will look at it to find anything outrageous.
Yeah, and then I think otherwise, I mean, it's funny. I was thinking when I was preparing for this episode, I was looking around, and it's like I've this is where you put in your banking information and your tax ID information and all these things that for most of these I set up for my original when I first created my developer account 8 years ago and have never changed. But there's all this stuff in there that I imagine is relevant when you're first getting set up. That's where you go to tell them what your employer identification number is. That's where you go and tell them, where to direct deposit your proceeds in, and so on.
Oh yeah, and I will say too, like this area in particular. I mean, and this applies honestly to all of iTunes Connect, but it is way better than it used to be. Yeah. Like when I first set up my very first developer account back in 2008. Things were very different than when I set up Full City for the magazine in whenever that was, 2011 or something, 12, I don't know, something like that. And then even between then and when I set up Overcast a couple years later, it was even dramatically better then. And I haven't set one up since then, but I imagine it's so much of this used to be so much worse and more cumbersome than it is now. Even stuff like... do they still do the Dun & Bradstreet requirement, the Duns number?
I believe so.
Even that, I had to do that twice, once for Instapaper and once for Overcast. I don't think I ever even did it for Full City. But even that, when I first had to do it, I had to actually go and manually register with Dun & Bradstreet, which, by the way, is a massive scam company. It is, you're better off, basically, whenever you have to deal with Dun & Bradstreet for anything, the correct answer is hang up the phone. That is always the right option, because they'll call you and tell you things like, this is about your business credit report. It's really important that you complete this, and that's all a scam. Just so you know, you don't have to do any of that. The correct answer is you get your stupid DUNS number if you need it for Apple, and you do nothing else with them ever. Anyway, between the first time and second time I had to use them, Apple basically created a whole automated form to register yourself with them through iTunes Connect. I assumed something like that is probably still there. And it was so much easier that way than it was when I had to do it the first time. And so all this stuff is getting way, way better over time. And moral of the story, do not do anything you don't have to do with Dun & Bradstreet. And if they call you, hang up.
Yep, exactly right. Trying to avoid them as much as possible, but it is probably worth pointing out along those lines, if you were setting up a new app or a new company as a new company, it's worth pointing out that a lot of this stuff does actually probably take a couple weeks, potentially, to get done. And so if you're launching a new app and you have a particular date or event or thing that you have in mind, you may just need to start that before the app is ready and finished, just to make sure that it's actually gone through and processed. Because I remember, I think for Feed Wrangler, I set it up and it's I wanted to launch sooner, but then it ended up, it took a week for Dun & Bradstreet or somebody, some part of this process to happen. And there was something I could do. And so it's probably good to keep that in mind, that you may need to get this all set up. Because I think you can submit an app before it's all ready, but you won't be able to actually appear on the App Store until all your business entity is all nice and happy with Apple.
Yeah.
The next section is the users and roles section, which as an independent, initially I would probably have thought I don't really have anything to do there. There's just me. But it turns out I actually have spent a fair bit of time in here, and it's fairly useful. So, for example, the three kind of users that you can set up in iTunes Connect are access users, or I think they call them iTunes Connect users, which is really useful if you are ever integrating any external service with your iTunes Connect account. So if you use App Figures or App Annie or any of the sales importing tools and things like that, I would highly recommend setting up a separate Apple ID whose sole purpose is accessing those reports, and you can set the permissions for that user so that all they could do with that access is download sales reports. And so you're not if someone else if somehow your login information was compromised at App Figures or somewhere externally, all someone could do is know what your download numbers were. They couldn't go in and delete your app or close your developer account or anything like that. So definitely an important thing to do.
And that's a real thing, by the way. Like a few years ago, one of those big services, it wasn't App Figures, I think it might have been App Annie, was compromised, and they did lose all. Like they compromised everybody's passwords who were signed up with that service, and a lot of us had to go reset Apple ID stuff because of that. And fortunately I had done the correct thing and had the only sales and marketing user in there, but heard from a lot of people who didn't. And this was a few years ago now, but it's something that you should always keep in mind. Like, if you have to give your iTunes Connect login to some other service to do some useful thing for you, make sure it's not your main one, and make sure it can't do anything useful.
Yeah, especially because the authentication for all of those, I believe, require them to store your password directly, because it's not like, it's not some like OAuth panel or something where you authorize it. You'll actually have to give them the password, and they have to store it somewhere because they need to then provide it to iTunes Connect. So like doubly so, just go in there and set up a user account. Honestly, I've been tempted, and I just never actually have gone through the process of doing this, of actually setting up, like different logins for myself even, so that I have an apps one that I go in for when I'm, submitting apps, and I have one that's a different one for maybe when I'm doing other kind of work, just to kind of partition that a little bit. That's probably a bit unnecessary, but it's something that I think about, that, your iTunes Connect main user is a very powerful and important thing for your business. So be very thoughtful and careful with how you deal with that.
Yeah.
And then you can set up test flight, beta tester, and groups, and manage users in here. I tend to mostly just manage this on the apps side of things, which we'll get to in a minute, where you can set up test flight builds for a specific app. But I imagine this is the place where you can set up, different testing groups or tiers and things. I've never really gotten into there. And then the last thing you can set up here are sandbox testers, which is like just a pool of infinite sadness, because the only reason you have to set these up is when you're trying to test like foreign currency in-app purchase stuff.
Or just testing in-app purchases at all, right?
Well, so I tend to test in-app purchases. The honest answer for how I test in-app purchases now is I create a test flight build, add myself to it, and then just do the in-app purchase in there.
It's so much easier.
I don't know why this doesn't apply to development builds too, but like test flight builds just do the obvious thing. They let all the purchases happen as though you're purchasing them, but then they don't actually cost money. And like, that's great. I wish there was a little developer, like in the settings app on your iPhone, there's a little developer area once you've enabled development for a phone, where you can change a bunch of, preferences and things there. Like, I wish I could just go in there and say, what's my local currency for purchases, and like reset purchases or restore purchases, like just set things up there. But until then, we have this sandbox testing place where for certain kinds of testing where you are trying to set up something, because you can, if you need to set up a user as though they're, Swiss, this is the place that you can go and configure all that stuff. But
CHF is very wide. Takes up a lot of space. It will fill your table cells.
Yeah. And so it's one of those things that if you need to do that kind of stuff, this is where you have to go and do it. But I have great sympathy for you, because every time I've had to open up that section of iTunes Connect, it just makes me sad, because it's so complicated, and you have to log out on your phone. And when you log out, out of whatever, you're sitting there like logging in and out of Apple IDs on your phone.
Oh no, this is one thing where I can say, like, we've talked in the past about how like having separate development devices, having a whole lot of extra development devices really isn't that necessary most of the time.
Yeah.
One area I would say it is absolutely the right idea is when you're doing in-app purchase testing. My rule is I never, ever, ever will sign into a Sandbox account on my main phone, because that only leads to problems where, like, sometimes for the next 3 weeks, you'll just get random password dialogue saying environment sandbox, asking you to re-enter your store password no matter what you've done. And it's like, it is so buggy and annoying to have those random, store authorization dialogues cropping up all over the place for weeks or months or years afterwards. So that's one thing. Like, keep sandbox testing away from your main phone.
Yeah. And the nice thing too about using it on a developer phone is, like, even if you just do it on a development phone, you still will sometimes have these crazy cyclical errors or issues with if you switch between multiple Sandbox users. And the nice thing about a developer phone is if everything starts to fall apart, you can just like hard reset the device, like blank all the data out and start again. And that's a great move, which is not usually a viable solution for getting around iTunes password prompts to just like reset your phone. But with a developer phone, at least you can actually do that, and it's a viable solution.
We are sponsored this week by Pingdom. Start monitoring your websites and servers today at pingdom.com/radar. You get a 14-day free trial, and if you enter offer code RADAR at checkout, you get 20% off your first invoice. Pingdom is an amazing monitoring service. David uses it. I use it. I have used it since long before any of you knew who I was, since long before Instapaper existed. We were using this at Tumblr since, I think, 2007 or 2008 at the latest. We've been using this for a very long time. I use it for everything since then, and I absolutely love Pingdom. So here's what it is. It's a monitoring service. It's a really well-done monitoring service. So if you have a website or a server, anything online that can be checked at a URL, and they could test for things like response time, whether a certain string or regex appears on the page, they can send cookies, they can test logins, stuff like that. If any of those tests fail, they can alert you in all sorts of customizable, wonderful ways. Text message, email, app push notifications, all sorts of stuff with amazing conditions and things you can set and all these different criteria. It can be very simple if you want it to be, and if you want to scale it up to like the needs of an enterprise organization, it can do that too. I'm a huge fan of Pingdom. They can't pay me to say that. I'm saying that just myself. I'm not reading any of the script right now. I'm a huge fan of Pingdom. It is great. You can use it for not only checking your own site and your own service, but you can even use it to test other people's pages. Like you can have an alert show up whenever like the WWDC page changes, or whenever like Underscore releases a new app on his apps page. You can have these things change and be immediately notified. It's wonderful. So check out pingdom.com/radar. If you need to monitor anything, if you run any kind of service, you need to know when it goes down, and you should be the first to know. So Pingdom can give you that at pingdom.com/radar. You get a 14-day free trial, and use code RADAR at checkout to get 20% off your first invoice. Thank you very much to Pingdom for their support of this show and Relay FM.
So the next area, we start to get into the kind of the money side of iTunes Connect, because there's the things that are related to the app and then the things that are related to getting paid. And the payments and financial area it took me a while when I was first starting out to realize why Apple sort of splits this out. So because there's payments and financial, and then there's sales and trends. And as best I can understand, like the payments and financial reports area is the kind of actually reconciled, like final transaction part of this, where at the end of every month or financial month, because financial months aren't real months, Apple will bundle up all of your sales, all your proceeds for the month, and write you a check, direct deposit that money into your account. And the payments and financial reports part is where you see that kind of rolled up, finalized data. That's also where you get details about currency conversion stuff, because obviously, if you sell an app in a foreign country, the exchange rate where you ultimately get that will vary depending on the time of the month it is. And so this is where that final conversion will happen, and you'll get a consolidated number. It's also where you get to know when they're going to pay you, which is thankfully less vital now as it was when I was first starting off with the app stuff, where like knowing the actual exact day when the payment was going to come in was very helpful for timing and planning cash flow and stuff like that. When things are a bit tight, it can be really helpful. And so this will tell you that. And also this is where I go, if I have any kind of revenue share deal with an app or something where, it's perhaps not crazy, it's not crazy uncommon to say, go into something with someone else and have some kind of, revenue share agreement. You'll be basing those on the numbers you get out of the payments and financial reports tab. Like, don't base it on the sales and trends tab. That kind of stuff will never reconcile correctly with what you're actually getting in your bank account. And so payments and financial reports is where you go to actually, get the number that you could use to base any kind of actual financial distribution from.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. Whenever you're doing any kind of revenue share thing, like I've always structured, whenever I've had to do something like that, I've always structured it as, you or I get X percentage of what Apple actually deposits into the bank account. Like everything else is like, this is all like guidelines, but like we actually calculate the number based on what Apple deposits. Whatever number that is, then you take X percent of that, and it makes things a lot easier.
Yeah, because otherwise, because this is getting into the next area, the sales and trends area, like this is the place that you'll actually probably spend most of your time. Like honestly, on a weekly basis, I probably go into here far more than almost any other place in iTunes Connect, because this is where you can see your sort of your real time sales data, and it's real time as of yesterday, essentially. And you can get all kinds of, yours is your daily sales. You can slice the data over a lot of different perspectives, and so you can look at it by country or by app, by date. Honestly, for me, I do most of my actual, like my tactical analysis of my sales, I do using the I think it's called the Auto Ingest API. There's an API that iTunes Connect provides where you can download your daily sales reports on in an automated fashion. I think we've talked about this before, where like I have these, this crazy spaghetti of script that takes in those things and processes them in ways that I care about, and then I end up with a spreadsheet at the end, and that's how I do a lot of that. But what I love in the sales and trends area is that it has the sales data for all of my apps since I created my developer account. So for me, that's 8 years or something like that of data in there, which is just really useful for every now and then. I'm trying to like look for, trying to understand an app's history, or I'm writing a blog post about something, or I'm just curious and like seeing being able to zoom out and kind of get a better perspective. That's something that even though the sales and trends data is so focused on like what happened yesterday, in a weird way, I find it most useful to just zoom out and really get these broad perspectives of like, what did the last 2 years of this app's life look like? And, try and use that to inform the decisions I make.
For whatever it's worth, I actually almost never use the iTunes Connect sales and trends area. I've been a user of App Figures forever, and I'm very happy just letting them do it. I find that their interface of presenting things is just easier for me to get around, easier for me to find what I need, and I really appreciate their daily emails. Like I've been like the App Figures daily email of like, here's how much you sold yesterday. Like that is basically my barometer of how I'm doing in my business. I've done it since the early days of Instapaper, and it really tells me, because I start to learn like what do I expect a day to look like, and I just always have this idea of like, what have sales been around recently? And so like every month when it's time to like get that monthly deposit or do numbers for the month, I'm usually not really surprised by any part of it, because every morning I've been getting an email saying how much I sold the day before, and so I know roughly what that means relative to like, how am I doing this month? Is this an up period? Is this a down period? Is this going in the right direction, or do I need to make changes? So I actually hardly ever use iTunes Connect directly for that.
Yeah. Whereas I think it's just a question of preference for something like that. Like I've tried a couple of services like that. Like I've tried App Figures. I think they used to have, that's the kind of one I tried before that. But like for me, it's never quite stuck. It's like I either go full custom in the, like I have my crazy scripts pulling something in and processing it, or I go entirely just using their stuff, and that works for me. But I know one thing I will say is you can get a similar email from iTunes Connect on a weekly basis. That's one of the notifications you can set up, where they'll send you an information like that. So if that's something that sounds interesting, but you don't want to sign up for a service like App Figures, you can just set iTunes Connect to do that, and you'll get it on a weekly basis, which in some ways is useful, because a lot of apps have like a weekly seasonality to them. Like I know a lot of my apps do better on the weekend rather than during the week. So it's usually helpful to just see it on a rolled up basis like that. The next area is the App Analytics area, which is a pretty complicated and sophisticated thing. And we've talked about a lot of the things in it, over time. But I feel like this is just a fun place to, I don't know. I know I'm a bit of a number file to like, I just love this kind of thing, but you can just go in there and dig around and try and understand what's going on with your applications. This is like a lot of the main reason I'll go into here is I want to take a look at, for example, what is my conversion rate from someone seeing my App Store page to downloading the app? Is that, and how do they compare app to app? Because there's definitely going to be a difference between a free app and a paid app, for example. But I have a couple of free apps, and so I look at those and I say, why? Start to think, this app has a 20% better conversion rate and compared to this other one, like why would that be? And then use that information to try and, make tweaks to my screenshots, to my description, or just in general think about what's going on there. And the reality is, like, app analytics, this particular type of app analytics, it's really App Store analytics is the place where it's really valuable, because a lot of the data in here is not available anywhere else. Like, there is no other place that we can go to get the number of impressions that our app received in the App Store. They do other stuff too. They do kind of the in-app stuff where, like, the retention values and number of sessions and, that kind of stuff that you could theoretically do in a third-party thing like Fabric or Roll yourself. But the actual App Store optimization stuff is, in this area, and it's the only place we can get it. And so it's definitely worth your time to dig around a little bit and just, try and understand what's happening in the App Store, because usually that's otherwise is a complete black box.
Yeah, I mean, and some of the things in there are things that you can't, like metrics that you can't get any other way. So things like how many views your product page gets and stuff like that, like and the conversions from there, like that. You can measure a lot of this stuff yourself in your own in-app analytics, but some of the data like that you just can't get outside of Apple. So it is nice for that. This is one area too where there have been many substantial improvements over even the last 6 months. Like this area is getting better quickly, and it used to be non-existent, and now it's getting good quickly. So I'm happy with analytics.
Yeah, and I will say it's an area that Apple seems to be investing into, which I very much appreciate too. That it did, like you said, it is getting better, and it's just, I love that it allows me to make more informed decisions. Like when I was recently looking at localizing, I think it was Workouts++, I was looking at, it's like I was trying to guess which countries I should localize into. And like analytics has some really great information about, what's not just my sales, because my sales data by country is very heavily skewed to the apps, the countries where it's localized into, and it has to have been a successful purchase. Whereas I can look at the people, what countries are people looking at the page, but then not completing. And that's a good indication, for example, of like a place that I might want to look to localizing my App Store description or my screenshots. It's like that kind of information is just incredibly valuable and only available in here. And the last area, and this is an area that we'll probably end up doing a whole episode about, is the actual apps area. And this is where you can go in and you do all of the actual, you submit, when you want to submit a new app or an update to an app, you go in and enter the information in here. This is where you get, this is one of my favorite buttons in all of iTunes Connect, where you can push the new app button, which is awesome. I love pushing that button. It's always gives me a thrill to do.
I mean, you are the best person in the world at pushing that button.
I've done it many, many times. So I love that part of this area. And so I'm trying to think, I was trying to think of things in here that you may not be aware of. There's a great section where it shows you the history of an app. So where you can actually go through and see, for each version that's been approved in the App Store, the dates for that. Maybe that's not that useful. It's not tactically useful, but there have been times when I've wanted to go back and reference that. And it's nice that iTunes Connect exposes that to you. And you can see, for example, when it went in review and then when it was approved. And so if you're kind of curious to look at the change of that time over time, like there is a place to do that. And this is also the place where you'll go to do things like promo codes or in-app purchases, changing the price, test flight stuff. And then now this is where you'll go if you want to respond to reviews. But this is it's in some ways it's like the least iTunes Connect-y part of this, because so much of iTunes Connect seems to be focused on kind of the business and marketing side of things. And this, much of the app side of it feels a bit more like Xcode to me, where it's really just detailed about a specific app, and the development process for that app.
So why don't we make that next week? We'll make that a part 2, which is the actual app section of iTunes Connect.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, tune in everybody next week, because we're out of time this week for iTunes Connect Part 2. Electric Boogaloo? I don't know. Anyway, thanks everyone for listening, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.